Soon I Will Be Invincible by Austin Grossman. A pretty super read, I might say. So, Austin Grossman, if you are unfamiliar with that name, is not only a novelist, but he is also a writer for video games. If you are a gamer out there, you may have encountered some of his work. He has, I believe, written for such games as Deus Ex and Dishonored. But this book, Soon I Will Be Invincible, was his debut novel, I believe, published, I think, in 2007. And it is a pretty interesting book in that it essentially renders a story which would typically be told through the medium of comics into the form of a novel. By that, I mean it is a tale of superheroes and supervillains told not pictorially, as would be the case with comics, but rather through prose. Now, I think that there have been some books since this book was published which have done that kind of thing, but I'm going to venture to say that none of them have probably done it quite as well as Soon I Will Be Invincible, because not only is this book interesting because of its kind of quirky subject matter, but it is also a very good book and a very remarkable debut novel, in my opinion at least. So, what is the story of Soon I Will Be Invincible? Well, after the disappearance of a superhero called Corefire, who is pretty much the analog to Superman in the world of this book, his nemesis, the nefarious Dr. Impossible, breaks out of prison and sets about plotting to take over the world once again. Dr. Impossible is pretty much the equivalent of Lex Luthor in the world of this book. But concurrently with this, an amnesiac woman who was grotesquely mangled by a vehicle is given a new lease on life when she is given robotic prosthetics and high tech physiological upgrades by this mysterious corporation, and is essentially rendered a cyborg super soldier by the name of Fatal. Fatal is eventually contacted by the champions, or the new champions, that is, which is essentially the this world's equivalent of the Justice League or the Avengers, right? Composed of such characters as Damsel, like half human, half alien hybrid warrior woman, Black Wolf, a non superpowered character who is very obviously this world's analog to Batman, and Mr. Mystic, who is like a Doctor Strange like character, and also a character named Lily, who is a one-time supervillain and also the one-time girlfriend, sort of Doctor Impossible himself, who has switched sides and is now on the side of the heroes, and some other characters as well. But that's kind of, the main cast, I guess, here. Anyway, so the plot of the book follows the champions, or the new champions, I guess, as they try to track down Dr. Impossible as he is out there scheming to take over the world with his super powered intellect, because he's like the smartest man in the world. Again, real Lex Luthor type. Eventually, it is revealed that Corefire is apparently dead. I say apparently because we all know how this goes in comic books. People rarely are killed off permanently in comics. They can be brought back and resurrected at the drop of a hat through a variety of means. But anyway, so now that the most powerful superhero is out of the picture, seemingly, Dr. Impossible feels like he can, like, legit take over the world this time. So this all culminates in a climactic showdown on Dr. Impossible's island, as he is going to attempt to, like, shift the orbit of the planets to create a new ice age which will allow him to cow the governments of the world into obeisance. It's like, just hardcore comic book stuff, right? But then it turns out Core-Fire is not dead, of course, predictably. He shows up, but Dr. Impossible actually beats him. It's like a first. And he is about to take over the world because all the other champions have already been bested by him. But then Lily, his one time associate, then enemy, now kind of independent, you might say, because prior to this, she has left her alliance with the champions and is just kind of on her own. She shows up and stops Dr. Impossible, thwarts his schemes, and essentially remands him back into custody. So he is taken to prison again. But as in true comic book fashion, the book ends with Dr. Impossible planning to break out once again to start the whole cycle over anew. So that is pretty much the plot of Soon I Will Be Invincible. Again, it's very hardcore, like comic book stuff, but it is also very, very engaging, or at least it was for me. Now, let's talk about the technical qualities of this book, and let's start with the writing. This is a very well written book, and I really have to commend it for the quality of its writing, because it has, I want to say it has like shades of literary prose in this. Like the writing is, it is by no means amateur hour stuff. I mean, obviously Austin Grossman had written before, again, for like video games and stuff, but as a debut novel, this is quite striking because of how strongly written it is. The prose is quality work. It's much higher caliber than you might anticipate in a story about costumed heroes and villains. It really does read at times like true literary prose. It's that good, honestly, and it has some really kick-ass little lines in here. There are a lot of like lines here and there that really jump out at you that are memorable, and I quite liked that. So it's getting a pretty high grade for me as regards its writing. But now let's talk about the characters. Now, the story of Soon I Will Be Invincible is told through alternating first-person narratives between Dr. Impossible and Fatal. And I was kind of skeptical as to how successful that would be. Whether you can differentiate the voices of the characters sufficiently to make them like really feel like, their own characters. And just how well that would come off trying to switch out between two different first person narratives. But I gotta say, it worked wonders for Soon I Will Be Invincible, because these characters really do come alive. Dr. Impossible, especially, just being inside that character's head was honestly one of the novel's biggest strengths. And his character is by far the strongest selling point for this book. And it's also pretty deep, honestly. Not only does this book have shades of literary prose, but it also has shades of literary characterization, because the characters in this book are not like, the kind of black and white cardboard cutouts that often people the pages of comic books. No, these characters are like deep. They are real. Dr. Impossible, once again, in specific, his character is very melancholic, and that's kind of something that really struck me about this book, is that even though it's about, like comic book characters, superheroes and supervillains, these kind of, wacky antics, there's an undercurrent of sorrow to this, which is palpable at times. And we see Dr. Impossible's backstory, his like supervillain origin, quote unquote. And it's really kind of tragic. He was, like always a gifted, like Mensa type pupil, kid. I mean, he inadvertently created his own nemesis, Core-Fire, with one of his experiments. Right. He also gave himself some superpowers as well, inadvertently. But throughout the book, he like reflects on his own life, and there's kind of like an undercurrent of lament to this, because uh, he he knows that, you know, he kind of cast himself in the losing role, right? Because that's how comic books go. You know, Batman always beats the Joker, Superman always beats Lex Luthor. That's how these things go. And like, he realizes that he kind of chose the losing side here, because he has lost so many times throughout, you know, his career as a supervillain. And so there's kind of this lament for what might have been. There's a lot of regret to this character, and it's honestly pretty powerful at times, actually. But not just Doctor Impossible, but Fatal as well, I think was a pretty well rendered character, even though her character is decidedly less interesting than Doctor Impossible, because she has no memories pretty much of her life before her career as a cyborg superhero. She's kind of a blank slate in a lot of ways, but her voice is still pretty well rendered. She feels like a living, breathing, or at least, you know, halfway living, halfway organic woman. And I can appreciate that. I think both of the narrators in this book were quite well rendered, honestly, to such an extent that it really draws you into their stories. Um, but so again, the characters I think are also very strong in this book. But now let's talk about the actual like story of this book, because A, this story is doing a lot, and B, the ultimate denouement of the story is kind of where it came apart a little bit for me. But I'll get to that. So first of all, this book is it's doing so much because it's essentially trying to not only tell a like comic book story, but it's trying to capture the entirety of like a comic book, like a long running comic books world within these pages. Like, you know, the DC and Marvel, right? They have these very elaborate, complex, you know, worlds that have been fleshed out throughout, you know, many decades of storytelling. And this book really tries to capture that. In Soon I Will Be Invincible sort of positions itself as like at the tail end of like the Silver Age, right? You know, you have the comic book Golden Age, Silver Age, Bronze Age, right? And I think this book kind of situates itself at like the tail end of the Silver Age, like it about to go into the Bronze Age, um, because the superhero team in the book, the new champions, are kind of like the second generation heroes after the original heroes, which were called like the Super Squadron, have all retired or died, pretty much. And so the Golden Age is definitely in the past. And Doctor Impossible as well is kind of like a fading villain from the Silver Age, who is trying to make one last grab at glory before his career is over as a supervillain, right? Um, so it's not just about like comic book characters; it's about comic book mythology as well. And it really does a great job, honestly, of capturing the very elaborate, complex mythology of like a comic book universe. But beyond that, this book is also kind of, in some ways, a deconstruction of like superheroes and supervillains, that kind of comic book mythos. But it is decidedly gentler in its approach than something like Watchmen, where the heroes are either deranged weirdos or sexual impotents. And it's definitely much gentler than like The Boys. It's definitely not like that, but it's kind of in that vein where it's telling this story that is so cliched, that is so like, you know, just trite by this point, but it's analyzing these elements in such a way that it's kind of breathing new life into them, because it's kind of giving them an extra dimension that you might not think of such a story as typically having. But it's, again, it's not like Watchmen. It's not like The Boys. It's not like mean spirited in its deconstruction. It's really more of an homage, I will say. It is rendered with evident love and affection for this type of material. And again, it's really more of an homage with some shadings of like parody to it, but it's really commendable, I think, for how much it's able to capture and generally capture pretty well within these pages. Um, but now on to kind of my critique of the book. This was gonna be probably like highest marks for me as regards my ultimate grading of it until I got to the end, because at the end the wheels got a little wonky there towards the end. So at the end of the book, in the big like showdown on Dr. Impossible's island, there's a lot happening. But first and foremost, I want to say that Fatal, our hero, the main hero of the book, plays absolutely no role, no active role whatsoever in the resolution of this story. It's very reminiscent of like Raiders of the Lost Ark. You know how in Raiders of the Lost Ark, Indiana Jones spends the climax of that movie tied to a post, playing no role whatsoever in how the conflict is resolved. It's like that. Fatal does not have play any hand at all in stopping Doctor Impossible, and I found that very odd. But again, that perhaps was another of the book's kind of deconstructions of the various tropes of comics. The hero actually, like the main hero, actually played no role in resolving the conflict. Maybe that was by design, but it struck me as kind of odd because it was very inactive. It was very passive on the part of a character that by rights should have had a much larger role in how this story wrapped up. But also at the end, there is a crap ton of monologuing. And once more, perhaps that was by design, because we know how much monologuing there can be in comics. Like, I'm sure you've seen The Incredibles, right? Where it's like, you sly dog, you got me monologuing. We know that there's a lot of monologuing in comics, but there was a lot that was conveyed through dialogue at the end of the book, which I thought got a little bit clumsy. And also at the end of the book, there's a lot of things happening that I don't feel were adequately explained. Like, I can't really go into it that much because I would have to like recap blow by blow the plot. But there's just there are things that happen at the end of this book which kind of, it felt to me like they came out of nowhere. And also, as I said, Lily, the one-time supervillain turned superhero, then kind of independent, is ultimately the character who thwarts Doctor Impossible's world domination scheme. But I don't understand why she did that, given that previously in the book, she like she actually like wished him luck. Like, there's a point in the book where Doctor Impossible is given this letter by her, because again they kind of had this attachment from the past, and she wishes him luck. She's like, good luck, have at it. Maybe you can conquer the world this time. But then why does she stop him at the end? I didn't get that. It was kind of like, whose side are you even on at this point? But again, the ending, it got a little wonky at the ending just because there was so much happening. Some of it I don't feel like it was explained adequately. A lot of it was delivered through dialogue, and I think it got a little clumsy. But other than the ending, I think this book was honestly pretty great, actually. And what I liked about it so much is that it's, once more, much deeper, I think, than you might be inclined to think that a story about costumed superheroes and supervillains can be. But there is some real depth to this, not just in the quality of its prose or its characterization, both of which are pretty good actually, but also because thematically it treats the comic book mythology as mythology. Like, in kind of the Greek sense, right? Like, what I mean is, Dr. Impossible's story is portrayed as kind of like a Greek tragedy. Like, he is a character who is fated to lose over and over again, as I said, because that's how it goes in comic books, right? Once more, Batman always beats the Joker, Superman always beats Lex Luthor, the Fantastic Four always beat Doctor Doom. That's how these stories go. And again, in capturing the mythology of a comic book universe, it actually recognizes that this kind of has a mythological element to it. And so it portrays these characters in somewhat like, again, kind of mythic terms. They're archetypes, is what I'm trying to say. And Doctor Impossible is the loser. Like, he recognizes that he is destined to lose, much like Oedipus Rex. He is like fated to lose over and over again. And that's why there's so much like regret on his part, because he knows he chose the wrong side, right? Superheroes always beat the supervillains. That's just how it goes in these things. But I really liked that because it added a somber element to this, and again, a kind of literary element to this, which complements the humor and the zaniness of it quite well. It's a very well-rounded book, I think, in that it's kind of, you know, tongue in cheek in the way that it portrays this story and these various cliches and tropes, but also there's a real like heart to it. There's a real emotional core to it, which is genuinely pretty powerful at times. And so this book is, it's more than just a goofy like comic book story about superheroes fighting supervillains. There is some real depth to this that you can pick up on, and I really appreciated that. So aside from the ending where it kind of, the wheels started to get a little wobbly, aside from that, this book is roundly excellent, I think. So to rate Soon I Will Be Invincible by Austin Grossman, I'm gonna give it a B plus. Again, up until the ending, this was probably gonna get an A plus for me, but then I kind of had to knock it down. But I would say this, in terms of just sheer enjoyability, this is A plus material. This is probably the most enjoyable book that I have read so far this year. I really just loved it to death. I really cherished it because of what it did, but also the evident affection with which it did it. And I think it roundly, like broadly speaking, was done quite excellently, except for the denouement, which got a little bit wonky. But other than that, I think this is a great book, and I'm going to give it a solid B plus, just shy of the A range. But I will say once more, I think this is a remarkably strong debut in a book that I think that a lot of people out there will be apt to enjoy just as much as I did. So Soon I Will Be Invincible by Austin Grossman. Have you read this book? If you have, let me know down in the comments what you thought about it, whether you have agreed or disagreed with anything I've said about it here today. And if you haven't read Soon I Will Be Invincible, I would highly recommend this to people who like, you know, read comics. Like, if you like comics, if you enjoy, you know, the exploits of Superman and Batman, pick this up, because this is a kick-ass story in that vein, that is written with, you know, loving affection for that type of material. It's really great. Once more, it gets a little bit wonky towards the end, I think, but other than that, I think this is just a fantastic book. And even if you don't like, you know, comics, if you're not into that kind of story, I could still recommend this just because of how well this book is executed. Honestly, I think it is just a quality book in its own right. So I could highly recommend this either way, but especially to people out there who do enjoy comics, because this is just going to be right up your alley. But as always, if you have enjoyed anything you've seen or heard here today, remember to hit that like button and subscribe. I would really appreciate it. And until next time, peace.